All right, so we're going to be talking about how to make a line graph. And so I want you to go ahead and write down for step one and step two. So if you're looking at your notes, this is going to be all of its own page. And so at the top of the page, it should steps to follow for making a line graph. And number one is to choose a title. Now, here's the thing about a title. I'll have a lot of students, for example, that'll look, and I'm going to go back up, that'll look at data like this, temperature of water at various depths. So I'll have students that'll say water depth versus temperature. That is not a title that I want. And so a title that I want you guys to choose is something that's in a question format. And so I would say, is my water depth affected by my temperature? Or is my temperature affected by my water depth? Put it in a way that it's making somebody think about looking at your graph. Okay, and so let's put it this way. If you have a boring title, I'm not going to want to look at your graph, nor am I going to want to grade it. Okay, so you always want to make your graph interesting to the aspect that it's going to make somebody want to look and analyze the data that is related to your title. Okay. Number two is to figure out what data is independent and what is your dependent data. Okay, so number two is to figure out what your data is independent and what is dependent. So what is your influence? Okay, influencer, which is independent. What is being influenced? Dependent. Okay, and so I want you to also write this. If time is part of your data, it is always independent. Okay, time is never dependent on anything. Almost anything we measure is going to be dependent on time. Okay, and then the next step is to find the scale for each axis. So I want you to pause this video right now and go ahead and write down step one, step two, and step three. And then I'm going to go ahead and go over how to scale the graph. Okay, so step one is to locate your highest data for each set of data. Step two is to figure out how many squares you have on your graph paper for the axis that you are using. And step three is to divide those two numbers. Take the largest data and divide it by the squares on the axis. Always round your answers up and keep it even. Okay, if it rounds up to an odd number, round it up one more number and make it simple. All right, and so I'm going to go ahead and go over the example that I see with you guys. All right, and so when we're looking at step three, we have to find my largest data for each axis. Well, to find that, I need to figure out what's on each axis. And so water depth and temperature. Is my water depth going to influence my temperature, or is my temperature going to influence my water depth? Well, if you think about it, water depth, the further we get down, the colder it's going to get. Okay, and so my water depth is going to be my independent. And so I'm going to write that up here, my water depth. And then my temperature is my dependent. Okay, now I need to scale both of them. And so to scale them both, I need to find their largest value. So I'm going to go ahead and circle each of the largest value that I see under each variable. Okay, now that's the easy part. Now I'm going to look at the graph that's on your next paper. So looking over, so you're looking at your notes. If you flip it over, I've given you a graph that you're going to graph this data. Okay? And so if we look at that graph, yours looks exactly like this. To find how many squares are on the axis, well, let's go ahead and look at the x-axis first. That's where water depth is going to go, right? And so we know water depth has 200, but 200 has to be put on this graph, okay? And so what this scaling is doing is making sure I use the majority of the graph. So I look on my x-axis, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 boxes. So on this x-axis, I have 11 boxes. So I'm going to take 200 and I'm going to divide it by 11, and that's going to equal, I believe it's 18.18. And I'm going to round that up to 19. But like I said, always round it to an even number. Okay, so I'm just going to say 20. Okay, so I'm going to round this up to 20. All right, and you'll see what this is used for. Now, my temperature, I have a high of 18, but now it's going to be on the y-axis. So looking at your graph, I have to count my squares on the y-axis, and they're always going to change, and it's never always, or it's not always going to be the same. So always make sure you count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So it's also 11. So I'm going to take my largest value, 18. I'm also going to divide it by 11. And I don't remember what that is. So 18 divided by 11. So it's 1.6. And now I'm going to round that up to 2, and that's an even number, so I'm going to keep it. Now, I want you guys to see these numbers that we got and what it's used for. So I'm going to go ahead and skip to the next slide, okay? But I want you guys to go ahead and look, okay, on the graph, okay? So this is just showing the same thing. So if you want to write it down, okay? So when we're looking at our graph, okay, on my x-axis, notice I go up by 20 every interval. And this is to make sure I use the majority of the graph. And on my y-axis, I'm going to use going up by 2s. Okay, and so I'm using the value at which I went up on each axis. Okay, so 20 was on my axis, my x-axis, and I went up by 2 on my y-axis. Okay, now the last 4 or 3 steps, I should say, is label each axis with a title and a unit, plot your x and y points, which is in the data that you were given, and then give me a line of best fit. And so I'm going to have you guys go ahead and graph this. And so on the next page, go ahead and look. So I've given a title in a question format. Does the water depth have effect on the temperature of water? Okay. My step 2, okay, which is give me my independent and dependent variables. Well, looking on the graph, based on where I put it, my depth is going to be my independent, my temperature is my dependent. And the reason being is because my depth's on my x-axis and my temperature's on my y-axis. Okay, if you guys want to, you guys are always welcome to write x and y depending on the dependent and independent and dependent variable. Okay, if that's how you want to show it. But I'm going to be grading it based on where you put it on your axis. Independent always goes on the x-axis. The y is always my dependent variable. Step 3 is to find your scale. And the scale is what I'm increasing my x and y axis by. So what we do is we take the largest number of each variable and we divide it by the number of squares on each axis that we're using. Okay, and so what it does is if you look at my graph, it uses the majority of the graph. It scales your data to the graph that you're using. Okay, and so it's just allowing you to interpret your data a lot easier. All right, so step 4 is I'm going to go ahead and label my x and y axis with both a unit and the variable, so depth and the unit I'm using to measure my depth. My temperature and my unit I'm measuring temperature, so meters and Celsius. Step 5 is to plot all my points. Okay, so I went 50 and 18, plotted the point. Then I went 75 and 15, so 75 and 15. Then I did 112. Then I did 150 and 5. And then 204. Now I'm going to have students, Mr. Sassby, can I connect the dots? My answer is yes. Always connect the dots. It allows you to interpret the data and see the incline and declines of your data. And so in this case, it's declining. And then my line of best fit is trying to go directly through my data. Okay, and I'm trying to center it through. It's not going to touch all the dots. It's just to see where my middle point is. Now, the question that I have on your notes is down at the bottom. What kind of a relationship does this graph show? Okay, is it a direct, is it an indirect, or is it no relationship? Okay, and so if you go back to part one of the video, we went over this, so it's in the front sheet of your notes at the bottom. Okay, and so if it's a decline from left to right, it's an indirect. And how you can tell on your data, well, look, as my X data went up in numbers, my Y data decreased. So as my X went up, my Y's went down. So what that's telling me, it's an indirect relationship. And you can tell by two ways: by looking at the data, okay, or by looking at the slope of the graph, which is a decrease from left to right. Okay. So on your next page, I want you guys to do your own graph. And Mr. Sasfy is going to check this the next time you guys are in class. And so again, you have a new set of data and you have a new graph. And make sure you're scaling this graph because it's not 11 squares on each side. Okay, the graph is different. All right, follow your 6 steps. Step 1 is to give a title. Okay, question format. 2 is to tell me my independent and dependent variable. 3 is going to scale the graph. 4 is label your axis. 5 is plot the points. And 6, line of best fit. Okay, so go ahead and graph your next graph that's on the back of